On the 13th of November 1971, Pink Floyd released their fifth studio album, Meddle. In the years since, the record has been overshadowed by the exceptional success of Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and The Wall. However, despite its more obscure status, Meddle is itself a remarkable piece of work.
Meddle's been lost along the way. It's probably the album from that period that most deserves a reappraisal.
For the sort of the slightly more curious, the slightly more inquisitive fan, it's always been up there as sort of an important work.
For Echoes alone, for the sheer ambition and scale of that track, it deserves to be retrieved.
This film re-examines the album, how it came into being, and the music itself. The seeds of Pink Floyd were sown in Cambridge in the early 1960s, when Syd Barrett and Roger Waters became friends. However, this relationship would not blossom into a band until the pair moved to London. Pink Floyd initially formed in London as a five-piece, but the group eventually solidified with Syd Barrett on vocals and guitar, Rick Wright on keyboards, Nick Mason on drums, and Roger Waters on bass. Despite starting as an R&B group, the band quickly gravitated towards a newly emerging mid-60s sound.
66, 67, when psychedelia started, it was like coming out of the black and white days of the 50s into the coloured, technicolor days of the 60s, which is absolutely what it feels like now, because suddenly people were wearing coloured clothes and doing outrageous things.
A lot of people in the British psychedelic movement in the 60s had grown up with the R&B boom, with the Mersey beat and so forth, the sound that really defined pop at the beginning of that decade. But as the decade wore on, they suddenly began to realise there's more to music than just strictly 3-minute happy, verse, chorus, songs in the charts. And once they realised that, everything began to take off.
American psychedelia developed principally on the west coast of the US, with bands like Jefferson Airplane, Love, and The Byrds defining the sound. However, in the UK, the scene was distinctly different.
I suppose one of the significant differences is that it was more blues-based initially. A lot of the people, a lot of the players, and people like Eric Clapton, for instance, who went on to be with Cream, have come out of that whole sort of blues tradition. And I think one of the points there was just the sort of jamming aspects of things. The pivotal album in the UK was really, I suppose, was Revolver, with Tomorrow Never Knows, and various tracks, the track by George Harrison that sort of takes on the kind of Eastern influence.
I think Pink Floyd are seen very much from the outside as being a part of that kind of British psychedelic movement. Obviously, Syd Barrett experimented a lot with hallucinogenics. That was a very big part of what Revolver the Beatles Revolver was about, and I think there was an element of that in Floyd's music. It wasn't standard blues or country or folk. It didn't tend to lean on that as much as a lot of the American psychedelic bands did. It was seen as being very out there, very left field, and so I think the way they looked and the way they played got them bracketed in as a psychedelic band.
Their musical and lyrical sensibility very much chimed with the times, being kind of non-conformist, experimental, trying to expand the consciousness and expand the parameters of what's possible in music, I suppose.
These sonic experiments were further influenced by the musical collective AMM, who Pink Floyd supported at Soho's Marquee Club.
AMM were quite an astonishing group. They started musical life in the mid-60s, about 1965, 1966. And they were this kind of very, very free playing,
for want of a better word, jazz band, who were doing all kinds of sort of, out there experiments. They were playing with saws and tuning in radios on stage. The guitarist would run, ball bearings up and down the frets of the guitar.
It's about expanded song forms and improvisation, and I think there are specifics as well. I mean, it's said that Syd Barrett stole the idea of running ball bearings down the neck of his guitar from AMM.
You listen to early Pink Floyd, where they're having these kind of solid jams that are almost like approaching the states of white noise. You can see where AMM would have been hugely influential.
This influence would lead to extended pieces such as Interstellar Overdrive, a song that has been credited with setting Pink Floyd on a path that would eventually lead them to albums like Meddle.
I think you could say that the very roots of the sort of Pink Floyd's progressive rock, it does come from Interstellar Overdrive. That's the obvious track.
If you listen to things like Atom Heart Mother and Echoes, I think Interstellar Overdrive was obviously the starting point for, these sort of long, epic, sort of instrumental pieces.
The idea of this long instrumental ramble is really it's the roots of where all Pink Floyd's longer and probably better instrumental rambles came from a lot later on.
Pink Floyd's underground reputation grew to such an extent that eventually they were signed by EMI. However, their first single was not to be as confrontational as some of their live material.
Arnold Lane had a strange hobby, collecting clothes, moonshine, washing line. They suit him fine.
Arnold Lane was the first hit single for the Pink Floyd. It fitted into what was going on at the time, and it didn't fit into what was going on at the time. There was a certain darkness and eeriness and eccentricity to it. It had a real edge. What the Floyd seemed to be doing was taking the classic rock and roll or pop structure musically and playing around with it. They were messing with your head by knocking it around. So you ended up with something slightly skew-whiff, but something that still had enough in there to appeal to the masses. Very clever balance.
Yeah, it was a different thing, but I think they were lucky, or they were clever to actually produce two singles like that, because it really did lift them out of just being a kind of a cult band.
With Arnold Lane and their second single, See Emily Play, gaining chart success, Pink Floyd entered Abbey Road Studios to record their first album.
Piper of the Gates of Dawn, when we recorded that was the very first album that I was going to record with the Pink Floyd. But as the songs came up, I suppose, as far as I was concerned, I can say it was intrigue. I was intrigued with because I knew nothing about psychedelia anyway. I mean, I was a jazz musician, and of course I'd just not long finished recording 3 years with the Beatles. So to suddenly, well, not suddenly, but to start to record this psychedelia, the songs, etc. That's the only word I can find, is in intrigue.
Piper at the Gates of Dawn was released on the 5th of August 1967. To this day, it is still seen as a true classic of British psychedelia.
You could well describe Piper at the Gates of Dawn as the archetypal British psychedelic album, more so in a way than Sgt. Pepper, which sort of belongs somewhere else altogether, really. But I think with Piper at the Gates of Dawn, there is this kind of, there's this rawness, there's this sort of bizarre mixture on the one hand of pop novelty. I mean, these things getting this chart. Same as you've got with Hendrix at the same time, pop novelty, plus this kind of like raging sort of psychedelic white noise.
But what made Piper at the Gates of Dawn stand apart from so much at the time was that it was eccentric, it was significant, it was eloquent, and all these were combined through Syd Barrett, who was a conduit for so much that was going on, so much that was dark, so much that was almost unnerving and a little bit difficult to comprehend.
I still find Piper at the Gates of Dawn to be a very impressive creation, and we're talking about a record that was made nearly 40 years ago. It still stands, no question about that at all. It's still absolutely in a class of its own.
However, despite the success of Piper at the Gates of Dawn, all was not well within Pink Floyd. During 1967, Syd Barrett appeared to suffer a drug-induced mental breakdown, which resulted in ever-increasingly erratic behaviour. After a disastrous American tour, the band were forced to employ the services of another guitarist to supplement Barrett's now minimal contributions to live performances. They called on David Gilmour, an old Cambridge friend of Waters and Barrett. However, despite this attempt to sustain the group, in January 1968, Syd Barrett left Pink Floyd.
I feel that the one album that Syd Barrett did with Pink Floyd, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, plus his 2 solo albums, really encapsulate brilliantly what that man was all about in a certain sense of his life. 4 years, 3 albums, that's all it is, but it really does still capture the imagination, because this is Syd Barrett.
I think that when David Gilmour came along and replaced Syd Barrett after his breakdown, Pink Floyd transformed completely. You might also talk about it as a sort of direct transition from childhood to adulthood. I mean, the whole tone, the whole pulse of Pink Floyd changes completely. A lot of that, I think, is to do with, the David Gilmour's style. He has this kind of very languid, very sort of liquid sort of approach to playing guitar, almost like heavy eyelided or whatever, very slow, very sort of laid back, but also very, very assured, very stately. And I think it's at this point that Pink Floyd take on certain airs and graces. They become a different kind of group.
What Gilmour brought to the table was a musicality that Syd didn't have. Gilmour had been in a covers band in Cambridge. He could sing anything. They were doing Four Seasons, Sam and Dave covers, Chuck Berry. He had a great, great voice, and he was a really, really good, proficient, kind of traditional guitar player, traditional in the sense of blues playing.
When Dave Gilmour arrived, of course, he was like a breath of fresh air after Syd Barrett, the difficulty of dealing with Syd. But David was, as I said, he was on a more musical appreciation of what I was trying to achieve in terms of a more melodic substance.
Syd's departure threw the group into turmoil, not least because he had been the chief songwriter and frontman. After the dust had settled, it was Roger Waters who had become the band's new creative focus.
The thing with Waters is he was the most, and probably the most obviously ambitious member of the group. He was probably the least musical, but he was the one with the drive and with the ideas, and who wanted to be successful. He wanted to be in a famous rock band. And he sort of saw Syd's departure as somebody had to fill that gap. He was a more forceful personality than Rick Wright, and so he stepped up. And his early songs aren't really very good, but he was at least coming up with songs and coming up with ideas.
It was no surprise to me that Roger would actually take over the leadership of Pink Floyd as it was then. I did always enjoy Roger's songs, purely because he was so easy to work with, much easier than Sid, you know, to get my ideas across to him.
Despite Barrett's disintegrating mental state, Pink Floyd had begun to record their second studio album. After Sid's departure, they set about completing what would eventually become A Saucerful of Secrets.
A Saucerful of Secrets is a real mixed bag, because half Barrett's on some of it. He's on one track, Jug Band Blues. He's supposedly playing guitar on some others. There's stuff on there as well that's left over from Piper at the Gates of Dawn, so it's not a very cohesive record. And also Gilmour had very, very little input on it. He was basically playing on songs that had already been, for the most part, had already been written.
Despite the unsatisfactory elements on the album, it does contain a song that would point in the direction of some of Pink Floyd's best work.
Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is the standout track on there, because in a way that really does point the way forward to Meddle, Atom Heart Mother, Meddle, and eventually obviously The Dark Side of the Moon. It's got that kind of sound which we associate now with that sort of late 60s progressive rock, space rock, whatever you want to call it.
Set the controls for the heart of the sun.
The actual lyrics are not so important. So with Syd Barrett, the lyrics were very important. But now the lyrics were not so important, but the musical structure was more important. It kind of moved Pink Floyd away from inner space, from the reflection on inner space, to, you know, the real and substantial physical thing that was happening outside of them, which was the exploration of outer space.
It's a very atmospheric piece of music. It's very much Roger Waters dominates completely, but you can hear where they're heading in the 70s. This is like a dry run.
The heart of the sun. The heart of the sun. The heart of the sun. The heart of the sun.
It's a kind of a follow-on really from Interstellar Overdrive. I mean, they've already initially got this kind of rough outline of a sort of what you might call prog rock eventually, but a sort of intermediary thing, which is like space rock. It's where they kind of really, it's almost like they've taken all the kind of energies that they've sort of built up and used them as a sort of rocket booster to go to some new place, to get away from this kind of, the sort of rootsier aspects of psychedelia, you know, the kind of, you know, the folk influence, the blues influence, and, you know, and really take the music somewhere else.
As the 1960s drew to a close, so did the idealism that had defined psychedelia. What was left musically began to mutate into what has become known as progressive rock.
What we call progressive rock is basically rock music that's made after Sgt. Pepper. I think Sgt. Pepper is the point that changes it. It's the idea that suddenly a pop song didn't have to be 3.5 minutes long, that you could do this, you could go here, you could go there. And a load of bands, British and American bands, were very much inspired by that.
That was the first album where the studio was used as an instrument, where avant-garde ideas, classical music were brought in, where you had orchestras, where you had this, where you had that, where you had the kitchen sink. So, I mean, I think, you know, progressive rock probably started with Sgt. Pepper.
Originally, it developed from a need to do something counter to what other bands were doing, you know, to get away from the 12 bars and stop sounding like Americans. And you'll find that most of that progressive rock of that time is almost unbearably English.
Another album to define the genre and dramatically influence other progressive artists was King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King.
King Crimson's 1969 album In the Court of the Crimson King was the sort of main jumping off point of progressive rock.
The purple piper plays his tune, the choir softly sing 3 lullabies in an ancient tongue for the court of the crimson.
The first commercially extremely impactful, very big album. It's also a unique record. It's never been repeated. It's nothing like that record, and it's nothing like anything else around it. But to say that it's the first progressive rock record would be simplifying the case.
You could argue that King Crimson were just taking ideas out of the sort of cultural ether, that the idea of experimenting with classical